Hi guys. Okay, so this is the PowerPoint video lecture thingy for week 4. It should have been week 2, but I figure it's better just to kind of keep the numbers as of the weeks that we're actually on. So now it's week 4. Okay, so Double Indemnity. Double Indemnity, directed by Barry Wilder, was released in 1944. It stars Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck as Walter Neff and Philip Dietrichson. Walter Neff is an insurance salesman, and Philip Dietrichson is the wife of a wealthy oil capitalist in Los Angeles. And it's considered a classic of film noir, and I'll upload a little bit of information about film noir as well, and we'll talk about a couple of the features of film noir throughout the presentation. It's set in LA, California. Although the city does not feature that heavily in the narrative, it's not mentioned that many times that it's in Los Angeles, and there are relatively few times that specific locations in the city are mentioned. A lot of the features of the film relate to its kind of urban setting, so we have to, if we analyze the film and we start to think of it through the frame or through the framework of its relationship to the city and to urban space, we find that actually it has a lot to say about those things, and that it's, a lot of what happens is determined by the kind of urban spaces and the way that those places are represented. Okay, so we'll just do a quick plot summary. And then, so it follows Walter Neff, who's, as I say, is an insurance salesman. One day he makes a routine call and meets Phyllis when he kind of knocks on the door and almost forcibly enters the house of Mr. Dietrichson in order to discuss a lapsed or automobile insurance claim, so a claim that has kind of run out and needs to be renewed. The two have a chemistry, and Neff says he's going to return in order to discuss her husband's insurance. And eventually, after a bit of kind of toing and froing, they seem to fall in love, and Neff decides to use his expertise in life insurance in order to create a situation in which they will kill Mr. Dietrichson and make his death look like an accident so that Phyllis will be able to claim on the life insurance policy that they will have taken out for Mr. Dietrichson. And not only that, but they will also enact a kind of specific accident which will fulfill what's called a double indemnity clause. Indemnity means kind of protection, and in that way they'll be able to claim even more money than they would have done. The couple carry out their plan. Neff kills Dietrichson and then pretends to be him and jumped from a train, at which point they placed the body of Mr. Dietrichson on the tracks, making it look as if he had died by falling from the train, which fulfills exactly the double indemnity clause, which they hope will mean that that Phyllis will receive a lot of money. Okay, so the plan initially seems to have worked, and Walter's colleague at the insurance industry named Keys, who is a very important character in the film, believes that they're going to have to pay out on Dietrichson's life insurance. However, the head of the company refuses to accept this and insists that he thinks he committed suicide. And following on from that, Keys, who kind of thinks that he possesses this kind of sixth sense, this intuition regarding whether or not someone has frauded their insurance claim or whether or not it's a real claim relating to a real accident, he becomes to be more and more convinced that Mr. Dietrichson's death was a murder, although he never suspects Neff until Neff makes his confession, which forms both the opening scene and the end of the film, as you'll know if you've seen it, which hopefully you have. And at this point, Walter and Phyllis's relationship begins to unravel. Dietrichson Dietrichson's daughter kind of tells this story about Phyllis having been the nurse of Dietrichson's first wife and the daughter's mother, and it makes her seem as if she was deliberately involved in the death of Dietrichson's first wife, and kind of paints her as this manipulative and evil kind of nursing figure who wants to move into the house and take over. And Dietrichson's wife also, Dietrichson's daughter, also confides that she thinks that Phyllis is responsible for Dietrichson's death. And at this point, Neff begins seeing Dietrichson's daughter, partly to keep her quiet, but also partly because he's beginning to realize that Phyllis is much less trustworthy and much more of a malevolent character than he initially believed that she was. And the whole thing culminates when Neff goes around to Phyllis's apartment to kind of tell her that the whole thing is called off. And they actually both carry guns. Phyllis tries to shoot Walter and then says that she can't and that she loves him now. And Walter kills Phyllis before traveling to his office in the middle of the night and records the confession for keys, which opens and ends the film, guys. Okay, so what do we take from this? How does double indemnity relate to the idea of the city and to the idea of how urban space is represented within the history of cinema? So one of the things is the relationship between class and urban space. Okay, so double indemnity takes place in Los Angeles, which is divided by lines of class and property in terms of who is employed in what kind of job and who owns what, essentially. And at several points in the film, we can see this partly when characters refuse to go to places that are perceived as being dangerous and poor. For example, at one point, Mr. Dietrichson's daughter is driven by Walter to kind of hang out with her boyfriend in downtown Los Angeles, which is an area which is much more rough, much more dangerous, but also more exciting than the area where she lives in this kind of faux Spanish villa on the outskirts of the city. And we can think about Walter's character in relation to this in terms of the way that he's able to move through the city and the way that he's able to move through different kinds of urban space and actually different kinds of class barriers. As a salesman, so as someone who markets and who sells goods and services, Walter is one of the few people who is able to move from working in middle class areas into the spaces of the wealthy. And we'll see this in a minute when we look at the scene in which he meets Phyllis for the first time. It is this kind of ability, this fact that he's selling something which upper class people are interested in, like insurance, which enables him to move through spaces like this. Otherwise, he would just be kind of kicked out. He would be ignored. He might even have the police called on him if he was someone who was judged to not belong in that particular kind of space. And we see this also in the way in which Walter comments on the house of Dietrichson when he kind of pulls up to it. He observes that it was built recently for about $30,000, which is a lot more than, or which was worth a lot more in 1944 than it is now. These days, $30,000 wouldn't buy you a big house in Los Angeles, but it would have done back then. And he also comments in a way which is kind of interesting that the house was built relatively recently in that it was built around quite a specific style, which was fashionable at the time that it was built, but which now makes it seem a little bit outdated and a little bit, we could say, passé, a little bit kitsch. And just bear this point in mind, because one of the things that we're going to see about cities, and especially about American cities, is that they tend to, in cinema or cinematic representations of those cities, often draws attention to the way in which things and buildings and architecture can become outmoded very quickly, and cities kind of function as like a reservoir of memory and of previous trends which are contained in the kind of buildings that are built in the city itself, but which obviously become unfashionable quite quickly. But you don't get rid of the building just because there's a new fashion in houses. So we kind of have this idea. We don't see it too much in Double Indemnity, but it's going to come back again later in the course. This idea of the city as this kind of stratification of different trends, different fashions, different, almost like different memories, like rock formations that pile up on top of each other. And this can happen very quickly. It's also worth bearing in mind that American cities are quite new, especially Los Angeles, in comparison to cities in Europe like Paris or like London or like Berlin, which are, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. American cities sprung up much quicker, and in this way appear to have this kind of effervescent and this ever-changing quality about them. It's also related to money as well, and class. Who can afford to build new houses? Who can afford the latest trend? Okay, so we have the next point, the femme fatale, and in Double Indemnity, her relationship to private space when we first meet her. The femme fatale is what we might call a trope or a classic characteristic of noir cinema. It's a female character who appears to be initially seductive and interesting and mysterious, but more often than not leads the protagonist of the drama in question kind of down the wrong path, and in some way or another either causes their death, causes their downfall, causes their suffering. And often the femme fatale is revealed to not be who she appears to be. So she may, Phyllis does this in Double Indemnity, she may appear to be kind of a victim, to be someone who is suffering in a specific kind of relationship, but then later on it may emerge that actually they have engineered a kind of vulnerability to their own personality in order to take advantage of a kind of naive protagonist. And typically the femme fatale is very sexually attractive as well, and that sexuality is something which has a large role to play in their capacity to manipulate the hero, or if not the hero, then the anti-hero, or the main male character at least. So if we watch the scene in which these two meet, it is one of the most important scenes in the film. We can see the way in which they kind of, Phyllis and Walter, develop a kind of chemistry, but we can also see the way in which Billy Wilder's camera presents Phyllis in particular ways and with particular aims in mind. So we'll actually now just watch bits of this scene, okay? I've uploaded it to eCampus anyway, but we can watch it and I'll make a few comments, okay, in terms of the way that it works. Let me just find it. Here we go. So we start with Neff pulling up. We have kind of a outside wide shot of the house. Neff is in the distance. He's walking up to this kind of villa. Like, notice the palm trees. It's all quite luxurious, but it also has this kind of sense of artificiality too.
It'll cost somebody about $30,000. That is, if he ever finished paying for it.
Then he knocks at the door.
Is Mr. Dietrichson in?
Who wants to see him?
My name is Neff, Walter Neff.
If you're selling something.
Look, it's Mr. Dietrichson I want to talk to for the Stop magazine subscription.
Listen, Mr. Dietrichson is not in.
How soon do you expect it?
Notice the way that Neff is able to enter the house because he, as I say, he has a kind of role to play as like a bearer of a certain service. He's there ostensibly for financial reason. And this kind of gives him the confidence to march in, and also notice the way in which the kind of maid, the servant character, servant is a strong word, but it's effectively what she is much smaller than Neff. He kind of towers over her. He doesn't really respect her, and he's able to use his position as a salesman, which is clearly a position which makes him confident to enter a space that he would previously not have been welcome in, and also notice the way in which immediately the shot has shrunk quite a lot. It's gone from quite a wide, expensive outside shot where you see the house, you see Neff is quite a small person, and suddenly Neff is very tall, and they're in a much more enclosed space.
Home when he gets here, if that's any help to you. What is it, Nettie? Who is it? It's for Mr. Dietrichson. I'm Mrs. Dietrichson. What is it?
How do you do, Mrs. Dietrichson? I'm Walter Nett, Pacific All Risk.
Pacific All what?
The Pacific All Risk Insurance Company. It's about some renewals on the automobile. I've been trying to contact your husband for the past 2 weeks, but he's never in his office.
Notice the way how when Phyllis is introduced, she's introduced at kind of at a distance from Neff. Okay, she's introduced as someone who does not exist on the same level as he does. And notice also the way in which the first time we see her, she's kind of she's away from the camera slightly. Notice the way that she steps forward. And Wilder, rather than presenting the two characters within the same shot, he cuts between this kind of framing of Phyllis within a light environment, wearing only a robe, again something which suggests a kind of sexuality, a kind of freedom. She's about to say that she was sunbathing on the roof, and he cuts back to Neff's face, and he's clearly kind of immediately attracted to her, and they engage in this conversation which, while it's actually about insurance and about his desire to see her husband, immediately kind of carries this kind of innuendo and these kind of sexual flirtatious overtones.
Is there anything I can do?
The insurance ran out on the 15th. I'd hate to think of you having a smashed fender or something while you're not fully covered.
Perhaps I know what you mean, Mr. Neff. I've just been taking a sunbath.
No pigeons around, I hope. Now, about those policies, Miss Dietrichson, I hate to take up your time, but...
Oh, that's all right. If you wait till I put something on, I'll be right down.
And now that Phyllis is kind of feeling seemingly more comfortable, we get the kind of full shot of her. It's much closer. We get a kind of sense of an attraction and a comfort between her and Walter. And again, they're not fully within the same space. And Wilder is emphasizing a kind of distinction between them. At this point, it's actually a distinction of class. Walter is still just a salesman, and she is the wife of a wealthy individual. But they are becoming closer to each other. Okay.
Nettie, show Mr. Neff into the living room.
Where would the living room be?
In there, but they keep the liquor locked up.
It's all right, I'll just carry my own keys. The living room was still stuffy from last night's cigars. The windows were closed, and the sunshine coming in through the Venetian blind showed up the dust in the air. On the piano in a couple of fancy frames were Mr. Dietrichson and Lola, his daughter by his first wife.
Again, notice the fact that Dietrichson doesn't have any photographs of Phyllis in the house, so we immediately get the sense that while she's his wife, they clearly don't have an especially intimate relationship. And the house is described as being stuffy from cigars. There's a kind of sense that there's a kind of absence of air in there, which immediately suggests a kind of unhappy home, or something not being quite right about the relationship of Phyllis and Mr. Dietrichson.
They had a bowl of those little red goldfish on the table behind the big Davenport. But to tell you the truth, Keys, I wasn't a whole lot interested in goldfish right then. Or in auto renewals or on Mr. Dietrichson and his daughter Lola. I was thinking about that dame upstairs and the way she had looked at me. And I wanted to see her again, close, without that silly staircase between us.
Okay, and Phyllis comes down the stairs, and there we have what we might call a reveal. We start off by seeing her legs, and then as she walks down, in order to enter the same kind of space as Walter is in, the camera zooms up as she's kind of finally finishing buttoning up her dress. So we could say that she's now able to fully kind of enter a conversation with Walter because she's properly dressed. The two are able to meet each other and to discuss things in a way which wouldn't seem inappropriate, considering the fact that she is somebody else's husband, according to the moral values of the time in which the film is set. But also Wilder kind of uses this reveal, to fully show Phyllis, but also to remind us of the fact that she was previously naked under a robe, and by doing this, we kind of get a memory of her previous appearance and her previous kind of status as a figure who is potentially deeply seductive, even though at this point now she appears to be engaging in a much more kind of normal interaction, normal or, everyday kind of interaction. Okay, we'll leave this scene here, but you can watch the rest of it on eCampus, and hopefully you've seen the rest of it on in the film itself. I just wanted to talk you through a bit of it, just to kind of give you a sense of what how we might analyze some of these scenes. I'm not going to do any more of them for you this week, but I'll try and do one a week, and then that way you should be able to kind of get a sense of how we might talk about some cinema. Sorry, wrong way again. Okay, so next point, the anonymity of public space. Okay, so we've had the way in which private space is represented in the first scene. We've had the kind of way in which being a merchant, being a representative of finance, enables Neff to enter a kind of private space that he would previously not be able to enter. And we've also had the way in which Phyllis exists in this private space, both as someone who is quite mysterious and seductive, but also as someone who perhaps doesn't quite belong. So we could say there's a kind of opacity to her relationship to that space, and that kind of opacity, that kind of uncertainty about someone's motivations and their role can make someone very interesting, but it can also make them quite dangerous, and that's a classic feature of the femme fatale type character in film noir. But we go from here to the anonymity of public space. So from the moment that they begin to carry out their plan, Walter and Phyllis both agree that they should not meet in private, because if someone sees them going into one or the other's apartment, it will immediately raise suspicion. So as a result of that, they actually decide to meet in public in some kind of disguise. As you saw at the start of the PowerPoint, there's a shot where Phyllis is wearing sunglasses, for example. And this is a key feature of the way in which cities are represented and what cities offer to people. It might seem paradoxical, as private space is a space which other people cannot see into. It's supposed to be your own space, a space that is shared by you and those whom you allow into it. But at the same time, a city like LA, or a city like anywhere with grocery stores, boulevards, and crowds, is a place where people can hide in plain sight. And we'll see this again in Taxi Driver, and we'll see it kind of being inverted and being used for horror in Rosemary's Baby. But when they meet in public, nobody knows who they are, even though they're in the physical proximity of potentially hundreds of other individuals. So bear that in mind. Bear in mind the fact that actually visibility, the capacity to be seen and to see, is also, when it comes to the city, a way of hiding too. Okay, so abstractions of capitalism and the insurance industry. It's a picture of Keyes, who is very important, very memorable character in Double Indemnity. He kind of represents the rationality of the insurance industry, and he, as I said before, he's convinced he possesses a kind of intuition which will always tell him whether an insurance claim is genuine. You know, he calls it his little man, this like feeling in his stomach, which will let him know whether or not someone is trying to trick him. And we see in one scene earlier on, we see kind of a working class guy who's destroyed his own property in the attempt to claim insurance on it. And this is a classic form of fraud. You know, you have something that you don't need anymore, it's insured, and you destroy it yourself and then claim it was an accident to get money. And Keyes is convinced that he can always see through kind of tricks like that and make sure that he make sure that the company doesn't get cheated. So in one scene, and the scene immediately following the scene in which the actual head of the company tells Phyllis that she thinks that Dietrichson's death was a suicide and that they're not going to pay her any money, Keyes insists that that's nonsense, and that actually, if you look at the actuarial tables on suicide, then you see that suicide by jumping from a moving train is just never happens. And actuarial tables are kind of tables and books of statistics which the insurance industry would use in order to make risk calculations. They were ways of calculating probability that became very popular towards the end of the 19th and in the 20th century, when the life insurance industry in particular really took off in America. And something that we can say about these kind of statistics is that the abstractions, you know, they take people's lives and the way in which they die and they convert them into probabilities for the sake of being able to make a risk assessment and therefore a profit. In one sense, they're kind of a mathematical version of the scenes of the trudging workers in Metropolis. These people are all different as they lived. They all had different deaths, they all had different motivations, different lives, different memories. But when you kind of filter that down into this kind of brute probability, this risk calculation, then what you end up with is something very abstract. And it's this abstraction which actually is used for the sake of getting profit for insurance companies. So just as in Metropolis, we saw these kind of huge crowds individuals who, because of the kind of work that they engage in, have become almost entirely interchangeable with each other. In Double Indemnity, this kind of representation of interchangeability and this sameness which capitalism can be shown to kind of generate throughout society, at least from one perspective, is, I would argue, you know, represented in actuarial tables and in the relationship to the insurance industry in general, which in some ways is what this film is all about, you know. And from this, we also get the idea of fate. So remember when we were talking about Metropolis, I said that one of the features of that film is the way in which kind of heightened rationality, what appears to be a very forward-thinking or technologically advanced society, can revert back into something almost prehistoric, into something very ancient and very old. And the way in which we see this in Double Indemnity, I think we can argue, is through the kind of way in which these actuarial statistics come to represent something like fate. So Keyes reads them in the way in which a prophet might read runes or interpret dreams. And it's this which means that Walter and Phyllis's plan is ruined, because it's Keyes's initial dismissal of the idea of suicide which kind of sets him on to thinking about how it was that Dietrichson really died, and he becomes more and more convinced that it couldn't have been an accident and that it must have been murder. And it's this which causes him to argue that Phyllis should take the case to court, knowing that it's likely that she will incriminate herself during that. So it's really this kind of fate that Keyes brings about through the actuarial tables, which leads to the failure of the plan and to Phyllis's death and to Walter's kind of downfall. And I won't go into this too much now because it's really just for kind of extra interest if you want to write about or do a presentation in Double Indemnity. But this also kind of generates the sense of the story as being quite a kind of conventional tragedy in which a character, in some way or another, is bound to a certain fate, and they're bound to kind of a fall or a fall from grace, which they themselves set in motion, but which nonetheless fulfills some kind of plan which they can't escape from. And yeah, we see this this characteristic emerges in the film as a result of the kind of tables and statistics which advanced mathematics and the insurance industry uses. Hey guys, okay, so tasks for this week. Watch the film, obviously. Rewatch the scenes, and I've also uploaded a document which is called Glossary of Film Terms, and this will give you a number of different shots and number of different terms for different kinds of shots and different kind of cinematic techniques, which I would like you to start looking at and start thinking about, because if you can use this terminology in either your written or your oral presentations, then that will mean that you'll get a higher mark than if you don't use any of it. Okay, so just start looking at that, start thinking about it, start familiarizing yourself with some of the terms. And also, this is an exercise that you can do if you choose one of the scenes that I've uploaded to eCampus and think about the scene using terms from the glossary. Note down 5 ways in which Wilder's technique as a director kind of contributes to the meaning of the scene and the way in which the themes in question are expressed. Sorry, that sentence has got a bit of a typo when it tails off, but I'll fix it when I upload the PowerPoint just on its own. And yeah, you don't have to send me this work, but if you want to check in with me, if you want to do it, then you can do, or also we could talk about it in the check-in session, okay? I've also uploaded some extra reading material. As I said, there's the kind of article on Double Indemnity and Tragedy, and there's also there's a film review by Robert Ebert, who is a kind of fairly standardly famous film critic whose work we'll be looking at fairly often because he's reviewed pretty much everything, and he usually has something fairly interesting to say about the movies that he's looking at and that we will be looking at too, guys. Okay, so I know this is going up a little bit early, but as I said, if you do have time to kind of do these exercises before Monday, then that would mean that we can probably have more of a conversation once we've checked in and answered any questions. If you don't, or if you can't make it on Monday, then just work it through as you can, and that's fine too. Give me a shout if you have any questions. I hope that you enjoyed Double Indemnity. Week 5 is going to be Taxi Driver. Okay.